All right. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our interview with Jared, Gwen, and Madison Lusk. We are going to be talking about what it's like to be a Mormon bishop and the family of a Mormon bishop. We've already covered their upbringing and their dream years in dental school, and then living in Farmington, New Mexico, and building a successful dental practice, having 6 kids, and raising them faithfully in the church and living the Mormon dream. All right. And now we're going to talk about what it was like to be bishop and then what happened after that. And we're so thrilled that Madison, you're here to join us. All right. So what was it like being called? What year were you called as bishop?
2008.
2008. And you, how old were you at the time?
You've been...
What year were you born?
68.
So you've been 30.
So you were 40.
40, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, called as bishop at 40. And you didn't want to be bishop.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so tell us.
There's actually a story behind that as well, too, because we knew that it was time for a new bishop in our ward. And so he did not want that calling, and he could see that it was coming. And so he kind of did a little bit of rebelling, maybe a little bit, and did everything in his power to
blue shirts,
yes,
no tie.
No tie. Yes.
You were like literally trying to avoid the calling.
Yes.
Yeah, you know how it is in the church, and everybody knows who's going to be the next bishop, and the rumors start going, about 2 years before the next bishop's supposed to be there, and so everybody, that's all they would talk about is, Jared Lusk is going to be the new bishop, and blah blah blah, and you kind of expect it. And so the closer it got, it was dreadful. It was horrible.
Yeah, and he stopped even wanting to go to the temple.
We would go to the temple every month, and
I'd be like, we didn't go to the temple last month. Like, we need to go. And, but he just, he was trying to be unworthy.
And I would say a few cuss words every once in a while.
And this is going to be a hard question, Gwen, but if your life is the church and you're a stay-at-home mom and it's raising the kids and you're starting to have this status in the ward, I imagine it could be very validating for a wife and a mother who's Mormon to have the husband chosen as bishop, because that's like the priest, that's like the big man on campus.
It's true.
Was there a part of you that was like, oh, that would be a nice validation if that happened?
I think so.
Yeah.
To be honest,
Yeah.
I think so.
Thanks for
really
being honest. Because it's like, I imagine there can be few reinforcers at times as a mom.
Right.
But that's a nice validation, especially
and
if you
it's
think
not like something that I sought after, or anything. But yeah, it definitely is.
So when the call came, you weren't as maybe bummed about it as he was?
Probably not.
What were you feeling?
Well, I was feeling nervous for him. Like when it actually came,
Mm-hmm.
it's a huge, tremendous weight, and I could feel it being put on him. And then I felt bad for him. So it was hard, stressful, and whatever. So, yeah.
Colt says they were definitely one of the model families. Do you know Colt?
Calcich?
Calcich?
Yes.
Okay, Colt's tuning in.
Love Colt.
Okay, so you were a little bit worried for him, but you were excited and maybe felt validated.
Yeah.
And there's status for the bishop's wife, right?
Definitely. There definitely is. It's not as easy as it looks from the outside. So when you actually get in the trenches of it, it's not just all the glory. So it's hard. It's hard to be the bishop's wife.
So what do you guys want to say about what it was like? Okay, I have to ask. So 2008, that's 3 years, right? 2008? That's 3 years, after Mormon Stories started. So during those 3 years, there would have been this, the internet was coming on. There was stuff on the internet. There was starting to be a building awareness of issues with the church and concerns about the church. Prop 8 would have happened in 2008. So prior to becoming bishop and up until becoming bishop, had you been exposed to any questions about the church, doubts about the church, activist, podcast, website, CES letter?
Nothing at all.
Any of that?
Nothing.
None of it.
Neither of you.
I remember vaguely Proposition 8 and things, but I didn't really even know any details about it. I mean, it was just like a passing thing.
So when Prop 8 happened, what was it like for you?
It was nothing.
Yeah, because we're not in Utah, we're not in California. Like it was just kind of, we heard about it, but it didn't affect our lives at all.
And had you had any reason to feel sympathies for the LGBT community or anything like that?
No, that's one great thing about my faith crisis is that it's helped me not be like that. So, yeah.
And so even anti-Mormon literature, had you ever been exposed to that or knew what it was? Not on your mission
never
or
touched any of that stuff.
Or even heard about the Tanners or any of that stuff, or that there were even controversies?
I knew that there was anti-Mormon literature and people out there and things like that, but I didn't know anything about it.
Okay. And okay, so what's it like being a bishop and a bishop's wife? What'd you love about it?
Okay, well, from the very beginning, let me just start with that. Like it was overwhelmingly emotional for me. It was like I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I could handle it. I didn't know how I was going to possibly be the bishop of this big ward and deal with these problems. And there's no training. There's nothing. They just throw you in there and say, listen to the Spirit. And one thing that my biggest regret, I mean, we can talk about it for a while, but I remember, I don't know if it was the first week or it was one of the first weeks that I was bishop. And after sacrament meeting, I think you walked by me and I didn't say anything. I didn't say hi. I didn't give you a hug. It was like I didn't even acknowledge that she was there. And it broke her heart. And I was in such...
How did you experience that?
Yeah, it was heartbreaking. It was, I don't know. It was just like...
How do you remember it?
I remember it clearly.
What happened? Tell it.
Like,
from your
I
standpoint.
walked by him and I was going to even come up to him and talk to him. And he turned around and went the other direction.
In the hall?
Yes, or in the gym, or I don't remember exactly where it was, but yeah. And I just remember feeling so unimportant. And I was just like...
What was going on?
And it was not, obviously it was not intentional. I was zoned out.
He was so overwhelmed and stressed out.
Stress and everything. I honestly probably didn't even see her.
Okay.
And I don't know if that makes sense, but it was bad.
Okay. And so you felt what?
I just felt just like forgotten and just tossed aside, So
did you have a conversation with him about that?
Oh yeah. With lots of tears to really lay the guilt on thick, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know. But it was so when you think about your husband's the bishop, it all just sounds, oh, he's the father of the ward. It just sounds just super glamorous and everybody just gonna. But it's really hard. I remember the first week, he would take these phone calls and he would the phone would ring and I'd be sitting right there and then he would get up and he would walk and he'd go in another room and shut the door. And I just felt just so excluded from everything. And just it's the first time in our marriage he ever kept secrets from me.
Which he's supposed to.
He's supposed to. I didn't need to know. I didn't want to know all that gossip. But it was just, I just felt, it was, the way I described it is it was like he had a mistress. But I needed to love her and I needed to support her. So I was actually, that kind of sounds like polygamy. It just, I don't know. It just was he has this other life that I'm not a part of. And it just, there was just, and the thing with being a bishop's wife is that this is the counsel they give you is that he is super stressed out. So you need to pick up all the slack. And so not only is he gone all the time, but you need to, take up any extra chores that he might have done and, do those for him. And, you just have to take on this extra supportive role. And it just puts a lot of extra, and our kids were little and there were 6 of them. So it was hard. So, but it got easier as he adjusted and it became less stressful for him. Then things got back to normal and it was okay. It was good.
Really quick, Boston writes bishop mode. I know that mode well. So she describes it as bishop mode.
It's a real thing.
Yeah, and he's not my husband when he's bishop mode. It's just it's you can't really describe it, but
Yeah.
And at first, like, I think most bishops are probably like this, maybe not, but at least with me, every problem becomes your problem. And you internalize every single problem that there is, and that's not healthy, and it's hard. With time, that gets easier, and you get to where you can separate those and not make everybody's problem your problem. But at the beginning, it is definitely like that.
Okay.
And so you can feel that weight and that stress on them, and so you try to pick up the slack. And anyway, that first year was pretty difficult, but then it got easier, and it was good.
Okay. So how did it get easier? Like,
I think you just learn how to cope with things, and life. That's how life is, and we adapt, and you get used to things.
Yeah, it becomes the new normal.
While I was bishop, I think my biggest focus was the youth, and I just loved the youth, and I wanted to spend as much time with the youth as I could. My kids were in the youth programs at that time, so I would go on as many hikes and campouts and things like that we could do, and I would, as much as I could, I would bring the young women on these big hikes, and we would have fun. And so I think that I would call myself kind of a lax bishop, as far as I didn't worry super big about following every tiny little rule and going by the handbook, and I tried to be relaxed and have fun, and especially with the youth.
so you loved being with the youth, you loved camp, you loved camping. Anything else you loved about it?
I enjoyed sometimes meeting one-on-one with people and trying to help them. Sometimes it was overwhelming because I felt like there were so many problems that were unfixable, and we were supposed to fix them, and I couldn't do it. I mean, I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not a financial expert. I'm not an expert on anything except for fixing teeth. And so it was overwhelming sometimes, some of the situations and some of the problems that you have to deal with, I think, people's mental health and welfare problems, money issues, and things like that are not fixable. So that was not fun.
So what type of training do you get as a Mormon bishop?
0.
What? So, I mean, like in other religious traditions, you go to theology school and you go to the ministry and you maybe spend years getting trained.
You know, honestly, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was made bishop, there was no training on anything except for how to handle the tithing funds.
Yeah. So they're worried about the money.
Uh-huh.
Other than that, there's the handbook.
Yeah.
I guess they say read the handbook.
Yeah, they say read the handbook and go by the handbook and follow the Spirit.
Yeah. And what do you think about that now?
I think there's a lot of things, if I was bishop now, that I would do differently, and I wouldn't follow the handbook, and I would.
What are the areas where you wish you had gotten better training?
Dealing with,
like, obviously mental health stuff.
yeah, for sure, mental health stuff. And this, I say this as when people come and confess sins to you and things like that I wish I had better training, but that's not going to happen because, I mean, the whole doctrine of the church is to come and confess and repent and do all of those things. But at this point, I think that is a harmful practice, and I don't think that's necessary. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about that for a second. So and there are other people saying things. Boston says Heber had 0 training. Jenna is stunned that the only training you get is training about the money. Scott Purvis has joined us, Bishop Purvis, who would brag about being called as a bishop at least 10 years prior to you. He and his friend have a running joke about how young they were when they were called as missions. From Scott's perspective, you were relatively older,
It's true.
But he says you get training on how to hold meetings.
Yeah.
But not kind of how to take care of the mental and the spiritual lives of your members.
No,
just the money in the meetings.
And the welfare issues of the members was one of the biggest challenges for me because, they have these financial problems and things like that, and we're supposed to determine if the church can pay for this or that, and how we can. I don't know. I can't even explain how overwhelming some of those welfare issues were to try to deal with. Just impossible.
Okay. Yeah.
And that weighs heavy on you because you're the one that's supposed to fix these problems.
People being poor, people being out of jobs,
Out of houses, no home or just different things. And
yeah, as we've talked about, lots of challenges in the Mormon church, always with the intent of making improvements in the church so that those who are still in it have better lives. Give bishops good training, like prepare them, train them so that they can not only do a good job, but feel good about what they do, be prepared, and meet the needs of the members, right? What about the idea that you just learn as you go and that's the best training?
that's not, you learn as you go, but I don't think that's the best training.
Okay, let's talk about...
And then the other thing that is, I think kind of a regret is, according to the handbook and the instructions that you get, you can't give people certain advice and things like that. And I agree with that to an extent. But I can think of a couple examples where people would come in and they would tell me they were going to get married to such and such a person, and I would know that that's a terrible idea. But I couldn't say, no, you shouldn't do that. And I think that in some cases it's appropriate to warn people of what they're getting into.
Sure. Let's talk about those interviews with children and teens and adults about sexual matters, masturbation, pornography, law of chastity stuff, premarital sex, infidelity, even adultery. Talk about what dealing with those issues was like for you.
Okay, now I will say that is one thing that I think they give a little bit of training on, is that they expect you to ask questions about pornography and masturbation and things like that. So, and I 100% disagree with that now, but I do remember, I think I had a really good relationship with all of the youth, and I think with all of the adults in the ward. And so people were comfortable talking to me. And I was loving, I think, and I was not judgmental, but I would never ask. I was super uncomfortable interviewing young women or any woman, and I would never ask any of those questions to them. And I remember...
So you didn't ask young girls if they masturbated?
Never.
That's good.
Never.
Yay.
That would have scared me to death.
Okay.
And I was in a leadership training one time, and I remember asking that specific question: how am I supposed to deal with this? This is the most uncomfortable thing for me as a bishop, to interview young women. And I felt a little bit betrayed because several people kind of said that I shouldn't have a problem with that, and that that's not a big deal to ask girls those questions. Well, to me it was, and I never would. Some of the young men, I would ask them if they would look at pornography and things like that. And at this point, obviously, I don't think it was any of my business. And then when they get ready to go on their mission, you're taught to drill them. And if you don't, then the stake president is going to. And so that is one of my biggest regrets. I remember working with certain young men getting ready to go on a mission, and they would have difficulties with pornography or masturbation, and they had confessed. And then they would go to the stake president and confess those things, and the stake president would make them wait for 3 months or 6 months or whatever, and completely abstain from those things, and it doesn't happen. They try and try and try, and they keep failing. And so they either feel terrible or they end up lying about it to get on their mission, and then they do it again on their mission, and then they have to go confess to their mission president. And it's just a cycle of terrible guilt and shame. And I know personally very well people that's been very difficult for them. And so I think that's a horrible thing.
Did you ever have, without betraying any confidences, did you ever have to deal with LGBTQ youth or adults?
One time, and there again, there was no training on that. And I honestly think I felt I handled it well, and the person was loved and felt loved, and I think that she still does feel loved. But I had no perspective and no education, and I was ignorant of all of that.
You didn't send her to reparative therapy or anything like that? Oh, that's good. I mean, some do.
Yeah.
What about law of chastity stuff? Just kids fooling around, having premarital sex?
All the time. and adults too. And there again, you have the training that we have as we go to the stake president. If we have a question and he tells us what to do, and what he would tell me to do, I would do, unfortunately. And I had a lot of people read things out of Miracle of Forgiveness, and I regret that because I think that's a horrible book.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever participate in a disciplinary council?
I did, as both when I was on the High Council and as a bishop, and those I regret. I mean, obviously, as a High Councilman, I wasn't in charge of it, but as bishop, I was in charge of it, and I remember those experiences very well. And
what do you regret about it? What?
Just that I had to pretend like really I know what God wants done with this person, and I'm going to be this person's judge, and it makes no sense whatsoever. You know, I don't think God would never punish these people for committing a sin. You don't, you know, restrict their membership or tell them they can't partake of the sacrament. Christ would never do that.
But you felt like you were supposed to.
Yeah, I felt like that's what I had to do, and so that's what I did.
And looking back, you regret that?
And probably the one that I regret the most is a young person that the counsel I got was that he couldn't graduate from seminary, although he had went through all 4 years of seminary and done all the work and done everything, but he wasn't worthy. And so I had to withhold his ecclesiastical endorsement for graduating from seminary, and that was not right.
Why not?
Because I think everybody is worthy. Mm-hmm. I honestly think every person is worthy. And for a church or an organization or a person to say that they're not worthy is ridiculous and unchristlike, and it's not true. And it's just damaging to people.
So would you feel those things while you were a bishop, or are you just projecting your current morality?
I'm more so projecting my current reality,
okay,
I think.
Okay.
You know, I at that time I was just doing what I was taught and what I felt was right.
Okay. Let's address an issue that's really important to Mormons. Mormons sort of are taught to believe that every calling's inspired, right?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that too.
Well, talk about it.
So, obviously, you know, the bishop is an inspired calling, and, you know, everybody thinks that they're called of God and all of this. And I'm just a person. I'm just a man, and I have my flaws, and I'm not perfect. And so I didn't feel like God wanted me to be bishop. I really didn't. You know, it was just convenience. And then as I served, and obviously I had seen this as I was in the bishopric and high council and things, that as you do callings, you know, the majority of those callings are out of convenience. You know, if this person works here, then that's who you call. And a lot of times you'll pray about it, but you're going to get the answer that you want. You know, and so when I would put serious thought and prayer and effort into some callings that, and this is going to sound horrible and people are going to think I'm a terrible person probably, but for callings that I thought were really, really important, like young women's president or young men's president or, you know, counselors in the bishopric, I would do my best to pray and pray and pray and try to get answers. And I never felt like I could get an answer. I never felt like God said, okay, this person needs to do this. I felt like it was always, I'm just doing the best that I can, and I'm using my intelligence and my brain to figure these callings out and do what works. And that's how the majority of it is. I think obviously now that's how it all is.
And this goes back to that one big testimony question you had as a teen, which is praying to God, trying to get an answer, not getting the answer. I can imagine how either consciously or subconsciously as a bishop, you're like, oh my gosh, now I'm really supposed to have that communication with God. Can you remember that first time you prayed after you were being made bishop to be like, well, maybe God will talk to me now?
Exactly.
Did you have that sort of thing?
Of course I did. And it was always a struggle for me. It was always a struggle.
What happened when you tried to have that bishop prayer instead of a normal member prayer?
I would have the same feelings and answers. This is my brain and my head telling me what to do. So
no God, no divine intervention. No. Was that, did that ever cause you to feel sad or to doubt?
It did. I always struggled with that. And I remember sitting in sacrament meeting, I don't know if this was before I was bishop or after I was bishop, and a stake president gave a talk about the temple recommend questions, and that first question about believing in God, and you have a testimony of God and Jesus Christ. And I always said, I always wondered if I did. I was truly wondered if I had a testimony of God. And so that was always a struggle for me. It was always a struggle.
Jenna writes, when I was Relief Society president, I prayed to know who I should call and nothing came. Scott Purvis writes, I can count on one hand how many times I felt clear direction as a bishop. And so other people are basically saying they
yeah,
relate.
and you will ask the primary president to give you names to be a teacher in the primary, and they'll pray about it, and they're diligent, and they have this feeling that this is the person who should do it, and then I tell them, no, you can't have that person, so they can pray, but if I don't agree with it, then
Well, I can tell you, as a counselor in the primary presidency, we just got a list of names of people who needed callings, and we just went like, oh, she'd be good, he'd be good, and so everybody does it.
And the point of this isn't even to criticize or to be negative. It really ends up becoming relevant because of the amount of trust that we put in bishops and in our leaders at the prophet level, at the first presidency level, general authority level, all the way down to stake presidents and bishops, because we're trusting our children with these people. We're trusting our lives, our money, our safety in many instances. With Joseph Bishop and Sterling Van Wagenen and all this Protect LDS Children stuff, we're finding out that wards have sexual predators in them, many wards, most wards. And the church has this long history of covering up sexual abuse, not excommunicating or just fellowshipping rapists and pedophiles and abusers, and then just calling them to other callings where they end up either in current or future wards, raping or abusing other children or teens or adults. And, one fundamental change that needs to happen in the church is the church needs to back off this idea that all leaders are inspired, because the result of that is that members put trust in these decisions that make them vulnerable and make other victims, potential future victims, vulnerable to the decisions of. And it's not just that. It's just sometimes bishops and stake presidents aren't kind, and they don't have good advice. And whether it's LGBTQ youth or a married couple, a bishop telling a woman to divorce her husband because he's not a believer anymore, disciplinary councils, all sorts of instances where bishops and stake presidents aren't nice or aren't kind or have awful training or personal problems that they project onto their members that can wreak havoc. But if the members are like, wait a minute, you're just a bishop. You don't have any better access to God than I do. So when you tell me something that goes against my conscience or my will, I'm going to tell you, sorry, go do your thing, but I'm not paying attention. That's kind of where I'm getting at. It's about the protection of the members and their own empowerment to trust their own inner voice versus ever let some Mormon leader preempt and override their own internal conscience or voice.
That's true, and that's very well said, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing, because we're just people. We're no different than anybody else. A bishop is no different than anybody else. We're no different than the prophets and apostles. They don't speak to God any more than we did.
Yeah, that's an important implication. How could it be any different at the stake president level, at the GA level, at the first presidency level? They're probably not getting any of these answers too.
And along with what you said, not only that, but if all of the members can realize that we're just men doing the best that we can, if they realize that, I think that they wouldn't put as much pressure and stress on themselves to accept callings that they don't feel comfortable doing.
Yeah.
They cause them all of this grief and anxiety in their families and things. They'll feel, like you say, empowered to live their life authentically and do what's best for them rather than what's best for the church.
Yeah, there's so many instances where a husband or a wife or young adults or kids should say no to a calling because it's physical health, financial situation, family dynamics, mental health, whatever it is. It would be better for them not to take the calling. But if you believe the calling comes from God, then you're basically turning down God.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And members need to be more empowered to say, no, you're just filling a slot. Like, that doesn't work for me.
Right.
Did you want to add anything, Gwen?
No, and actually, the last calling that I took, they called me to be Cub Scouts, and I'm over being in Cub Scouts. Like, I'm done. And I straight up asked him if he prayed about it because I didn't feel that it was an inspired calling. I felt like it was just a calling of convenience and that this wasn't going to help my spiritual growth.
Yeah.
And that I have been doing this for so long. Like, I felt like I could have been used somewhere better. And he didn't say that he prayed about it. And I didn't.
Your husband or
No, it was
the
it
other
was
bishop,
recently.
a subsequent bishop.
So
Okay.
it was a member of the bishopric.
Because you guys were in a mixed faith marriage for a while.
Yes.
Yeah.
And anyway, I almost said no, but in the end, I said yes, and I ended up actually really enjoying it, and it was fine. But it was good. I love little 9-year-old boys. They're fun.
Sure.
So.
I will say one other thing about being bishop that I loved was the opportunity that I had to be with my kids and to interview them and send them on missions and things like that. It was great.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's bring Madison in. So talk about you talked about this a bit, but any insight on what it was like watch your dad be a bishop, how it affected the family, and then how it affected you, and anything else you want to share about all that?
I think for the most part it was good. Like, we all just wanted to be behind him and support him and just be that good, like, model Mormon family, I guess, like, just to be a good example. And yeah, I liked having him there to interview me for certain things, like for my baptism. I remember him interviewing me, and my first temple recommend, he interviewed me for.
Did I ask you about masturbation ever?
No, he didn't. Definitely not.
Did you date boys while he was bishop at all? You were
No,
too young, right?
Yeah, I was too young. Yeah. So I never
13.
did.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so part of it is you weren't an older teen, maybe, and part of it was you were a good girl, and I'll put that in air quotes. But you didn't have things maybe you were as embarrassed about. Is that true, or?
Yeah, I think a big part of it just because I was so young, so I definitely have a different perspective. But yeah, I think I did feel a little bit of pressure, I guess. Like, I was talking to them about this the other day that my first temple recommend, I was so, like, nervous to go in there because I didn't really know if I was going to be worthy. I mean, I wasn't really doing anything wrong from what I remember, but I was just, like, so worried I wasn't going to be worthy. And, like, when he told me I was worthy, I just, like, started crying. And I don't know.
Because why?
I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm worthy to enter into the Lord's house. And it was kind of like a moving moment, I guess, for me.
That's sweet. Because your dad or because God or both?
I think both.
Yeah. If your dad says you're worthy, then maybe you're worthy. And if the Lord says you're worthy, then you're really worthy, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
My boys who were older than her weren't quite as perfect, though.
They might have enjoyed those interviews less.
Yeah.
Madison, anything else you want to share about, that those 5 years? Was it 5 years when your dad was bishop? You said you weren't missing him. You weren't. A lot of people say, I didn't ever see my dad because he was always gone. I felt resentful that he wasn't able to be the dad I needed him to be.
Yeah, I think that's like the case in a lot of times, but it really wasn't the case for me. Like,
Okay.
I really didn't mind it, I guess. Maybe that makes me not as good of a daughter, but yeah.
Okay. All right.
We still tried as much as we could to have family time and do things together. And so we did as much of that as we could. And so I think that it worked out.
Okay. Thank you, Madison.
Yeah.
So some comments from our listeners. Kristen Norton writes, thank you for your courage and sharing your story. It's a gift to hear it. Mark writes, and this is just Mark's perspective, the church is not just unhealthy, it's dangerous. Such a great point that members are not protected. I mean, in the best cases, bishops do a great job and members' lives are blessed by their service. But I thanks, Mark, for acknowledging the idea that trust put in the wrong hands can harm people, and certainly that happens as well. Jenna writes, I lived in a ward in Newport Beach, California that had a sexual predator in it for years in the young men's program, which the church made a settlement. So yeah, it's just crazy. Like we interviewed Chris Swallow, who talked about Lowell Robinson, who was sexually abusing boys before he became a mission president. When he gets called as a mission president, at least three young men go to the church headquarters and say, this man you've just called as a mission president has been sexually abusing us. They ignored the three young men and let him serve a full 3 years as a mission president over young men and women. He gets home, gets called as a stake president, again, as someone who had a serial history of abusing young men for years and years and years. Finally, someone stands up to him in the church, complains to Lowell Robinson and to the church about his sexual predation. When the church releases Lowell Robinson, sort of by legal gunpoint, they put him in the primary. I don't mean to laugh, but like that's what this church is doing. It's sticking sexual predators in all these different places in young men's and young women. We know that Joseph Bishop, after raping McKenna Denson and abusing other people, his most recent calling, decades after who knows how many people he abused, he's in the Sunday school presidency over youth. Like, what is the church doing? Like, church, you need to get a system for tracking rapists and sexual predators and pedophiles. And instead of tagging LGBTQ people who are as safe as any people in terms of what they're going to do to youth or children, it's heterosexual men that are often the predators, not gay men and women. Instead of flagging with asterisks like in the Benji Schwimmer interview, we know, they were gay or they had a gay relationship. Let's put an asterisk by their name. How about putting asterisks by rapists and pedophiles and people who have a history of sexual abuse? Please update your member tracking records so we're not putting sex offenders in youth programs. So anyway, that's a little rant, but Jenna, thank you for sharing your story. Thousands and thousands of times over, this continues to happen, and the church needs to fix that. Mark writes, my mother had issues for years with unkindness from male leaders. She resigned in 2000, but was out years before that. And sometimes, sounds like you were a kind, loving bishop, but sometimes, as we learned from Scott Purvis's interview, he had a really vicious, mean stake president, and they can cause a lot of harm, a lot of damage. Jaden writes something interesting. Let's just address this while we're at it. No offense to any of the families or former bishops who have been called before, but I always wondered if there were better bishops, quote, God could have called through real revelation that weren't medical professionals, business owners, CFOs, accountants, etc. Jaden writes, it's sad that members are taught that God called these people when in reality they fit the image and social status it requires to be this icon. I think it would be okay to pay or subsidize a bishop that can dedicate their time to the work, a huge shift in thinking and procedure, but I don't think paid clergy such as a bishop is all that bad. For some reason, the church tries to spin the whole unpaid clergy as the awesome thing and calls out other churches for being bad for doing so, except for those retired dudes in Salt Lake City that are getting paid. So thanks, Jaden. So he's bringing up 2 points. One is that why is it always the lawyers, the doctors, the dentists, the orthodontists that are called as bishops? Why isn't it the school teacher? Why isn't it the janitor? Why isn't it the dude working at the 7-Eleven? I mean, obviously more educated, maybe more seasoned at administration. Any thoughts on that as being one of those dentists?
I think overall that's very valid comment, and it's true.
Were there middle to lower class members of your ward that you think would have been great bishops?
I think so. I think vast majority of the time that's true. I will say that my dad was called as bishop before he died, and it was kind of a surprise to me for those very reasons, because he was never
He was a dentist? No, that was her dad.
No.
My dad.
Okay. your dad.
He was.
What was his
He was
profession?
poor, and he was never, very up there socioeconomically or anything like that, and he wasn't very educated. He went from job to job, so he doesn't fit that mold. But I guarantee you, he was probably one of the best bishops that ward had, because he was caring and loving, and he was a real person.
Yeah.
So I agree with that 100%. I think, and I don't see this ever happening, but I think so many of these problems could be fixed in the church if they would just come clean about their history and just tell everybody that it's really not God's church. It's just a church like anybody else, and it's ran by man. And I think the whole premise that everything is, all of these callings and all of these leaders get all of this inspiration from God is dangerous and harmful to people.
Yeah. And let's just try and go both sides. Like, aren't there a bunch of amazing bishops that do amazing things, that serve people, that are kind and loving and really bless people's lives?
I think the majority of them are.
Yeah.
I have no problem with the majority of the bishops and stake presidents and leaders. I think they're all genuinely good people. I think a lot of times they're I don't know, how do I say it? They're just doing what they've been taught, and what they've learned their whole life, and they're a yes man, and following the handbooks and doing what they think the church wants them to do. I do think there are some harmful ones out there, though, and some of them that have personalities that are harmful to people and things like that.
To play devil's advocate for a second, to this the second point that Jaden was making was the paid clergy thing. On the one hand, having professionally trained, studying for multiple years, compensated clergy might have its benefits. On the other hand, all those Catholic priests that were pedophiles were paid clergy. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and they had lots of training. So, I assume. So, I mean, years in the seminary or whatever that is. So,
I think it just goes to the normal everyday members of churches need to be more vigilant and more aware.
Protect yourself.
And protect yourself.
yeah. But
Don't
again,
put all this trust in these people.
But some would say the bishop program works because, by and large, great men do great service. They don't have all the training in the world. Yeah, there's some bad apples. Yeah, they make a few mistakes. But overall, what if someone were to say, hey, the bishop's program is pretty good? Because
I know, and people say that, but they're not the ones that have been affected negatively by the bad ones.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Did you want to add anything to that,
Nope,
Gwen?
I think we've covered that.
Okay.
That's good.
Pam writes, sad that you have to have a temple recommend to go into the Lord's house. So she's just talking about worthiness culture, right? Mm-hmm. And again, this point that you made that you get to determine someone's worthiness as a man.
Yeah, it's not right.
Yeah, that's not right. Shandy writes, I turned down Cub Scouts when my husband was working 70 plus hours a day. Also, at that time, we were trying to find what was medically wrong with my son. I was just struggling to breathe and couldn't handle much more. I felt so guilty. So we're sad, Shandy, that you had to experience guilt for doing what was healthy for you.
Yeah,
and your
good for
family.
turning it down.
Yeah, good for you. Chris writes, we had a missionary called to be branch president for a while when I was a kid. Yeah, I served as a branch president twice on my mission. Not 20-year-old kid, like that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think I did a good job, but I had no business telling married couples and families what to do with their lives, right? Emily writes, my mom was counseled by both her bishop and her stake president to stay in her abusive marriage. Now, there's an example. Very common where women experience abuse or children experience abuse, and the bishop is like, stay in the abusive marriage. Don't go to the authorities. Don't report the abuse to the police. Can you talk about that sort of training, about how the church and Kurt McConkie taught you or didn't teach you to handle abuse cases?
I didn't have a lot of exposure to that, a little bit, and it's what you're saying is true, and that for the abuse can be defined in so many different ways, and a lot of times we think of abuse as physical abuse, and I think most times, at least in my mind, if there was physical abuse, I would encourage them to I never had that. I never had to deal with physical abuse, but if they did, I would have encouraged them to get out and to seek, go to the authorities. But there's also abuse, other types of abuse that can happen in marriages and things that
Emotional abuse.
and I think that's just as damaging. And But as leaders, I don't think that we're encouraged at all to encourage them to get out or anything like that. And there's a couple cases I regret of that I pushed them to staying longer than I should have, and they ended up getting out anyway. And it was the right thing.
Yeah. Emily goes on to write, this bishop and stake president who encouraged her to stay in her abusive marriage said they were inspired by God to tell her. So again, this is the idea that God's going to tell some bishop and stake president what to do with your life. And then we believe it and we give them that power. And we know they're not having any better access to God than any of us. And so it's trumping your own personal awareness of your life, your own moral authority, your own conscience, your own sense for right and wrong, giving that to these dudes.
And I think that's where leaders cross the line. Me personally, I would have never said that God told me to tell you this, but I think when leaders do say that, that's wrong.
Yeah. And most members really do have that level of trust. I'm not exaggerating.
No.
We all have that level of trust in our bishops and stake presidents as Mormons, or most of us do. Bambi writes, maybe the church calls a successful businessman to be bishop so that they will be less likely to steal from the church. So she's basically saying financial motives. I don't think that's true, because there's a lot of fraud and embezzlement with bishops and stake presidents. Yeah. But, that's fun.
I think my opinion on that is that is their way to get these men to work up the ranks and to, they can test them and see they're going to be more prone to get somebody in the 70 or the apostles or whatever that has worked up through the ranks, and it's those type of people that they're looking for. And so if you can be a bishop and you toe the line, and then you're a stake president and you toe the line, then it just works its way up, and I think that's why they do that.
I mean, let's face it, it's an administrative calling, and the farther up you go, the more you're becoming an administrator. Mm-hmm. And if you've managed a successful dental practice, you've gone to graduate school, you manage an office with lots of employees, you learn leadership and you learn management techniques. And why wouldn't they want those types of people ascending up the ranks? What's sad about that is it's not necessarily about your ability to spiritually and mentally and physically meet the needs of your members, sort of the pastoral care. It's more about, it seems like it might be more about bureaucratic leadership than pastoral spiritual care of your members. Is that fair to say?
I think so.
Yeah. Even though you may have done a great job, and I'm sure there are lots of bishops that do a great
But even
job.
though you do a great job of that pastoral part, it's the majority of your time is dealt with administrative things.
Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ryan writes, my hunch is that the successful men are called into leadership, and he has successful in air quotes, because they're less likely to experience financial strain when working less and also have a lot of sunk cost tithing to make them loyal. So you would have been more loyal and you would have had more disposable time to serve, resources to serve.
I agree with that, other than probably the tithing statement. I don't think that, I mean, I paid a lot of money in tithing, but it didn't make it. I don't feel like that made me more loyal to them or anything like that. I don't think that influenced anything that I did.
Chris writes, my mom was counseled to stay in an abusive relationship. Priesthood is paramount in the church. Mark writes, good, yes, men still perpetuate, which is that worthiness is happiness, and this is the greatest untruth of Mormonism, that worthiness is happiness. Sadie writes, I hate that I feel far more worthy to be in the temple now because I'm a lot less judgmental now that I was back then when I was a TBM, and my Mormon standards, I am no longer permitted in the presence of the Lord. I'm going to read that again. I hate that I feel far more worthy to be in the temple now. Okay, because she's basically saying I'm less judgmental now. Yeah. I'm a more kind and compassionate person, and yet now I wouldn't be viewed as being temple worthy, but back then I was, when I was kind of a jerk.
Exactly.
And that's a good point. The church, if it's like, oh, tea and coffee and whatever, you can't go. But, you know, but if you're a hypocrite and a liar and a judgmental jerk or whatever, you can. and that sometimes the standards are a little bit.
I know people who struggled their whole life with word of wisdom things, and they were the best people in the world, but they couldn't go to the temple because of that, and it was very damaging to them.
Yeah. Penny writes, I got called to be a den mother when expecting my 11th child.
Oh, goodness.
I was having problems with the pregnancy, and my husband was out of town for months at a time. The bishopric member came to my house to call me. I told him that I could not do it, but it was emotional, right? Yeah, well, if there was any inspiration, that calling would have never happened. All right. Well, lots of really cool comments from listeners. So anyway, during your time as bishop, did you ever have people have a faith crisis, and or were you ever exposed to any, questions or doubts about the church, podcast, CES letter? Because you would have served up until 2013. So certainly by then, that Kate Kelly and I had been, threatened with excommunication in 2011. Kate was excommunicated in 2011. I was excommunicated in 2012. The Gospel Topics Essays started coming out in 2013. Did you have any exposure to any of that Mormon internet stuff at all?
Zero.
Isn't that weird?
It is.
crazy.
It's crazy how much
by
of
then
a bubble we're in.
By then, that's
I
8
had
years
heard
into
of-
Mormon Stories.
I had heard of Kate Kelly, but not John DeLynn.
Okay. And I'm not saying I'm a big deal. I'm just saying,
No,
talk
yeah.
about the bubble. Like, that's kind
Yes.
of bizarre, right?
Yeah, and I never had anybody come to me with faith crisis issues. Obviously, people went inactive for whatever reasons, and people stopped believing. But I never had to deal with that specifically.
Yeah.
And I too had heard of Kate Kelly, but I didn't. I knew what her cause was, but I didn't really think about it.
How
and
does
worry
the
about
church control people's awareness of issues?
It's just baffling. Yeah, it's amazing. I don't know how it's confusing.
It's frustrating.
We'll talk about that. Like, why is it confusing? Why is it frustrating?
I don't know. It's just like now that we've been through our faith crisis and we're in our faith transition and we're a part of the ex-Mormon community, and I feel like I know so much more about what goes on in the church than any of my family that is still completely 100% active.
Isn't that weird?
It's just crazy. Like, they didn't know anything about Joseph Bishop. They've never heard of Sam Young. I just don't know how I can.
A lot of them don't know about the essays, and if they do, they won't read them.
Yeah. Yeah, the somehow the lock the church has on its members' awareness to its history, to the news, to the problems is profound.
Yeah, and maybe it's because we're just so busy that
what I was gonna say.
we have to read our scriptures. Like, we don't have time to be reading. We're so busy, and we have all these callings that we're doing. And Mormonism in the grand scheme of the world is small, so it's not making national news. So even if you are watching the news, you're not hearing these stories. So, I don't really know. So busy. We have so much
I think that's
to do.
one of the biggest things is they keep you so busy doing, whether it's reading your scriptures and praying and doing genealogy work and doing indexing and going to the temple and writing in your journal and serving in your callings, and it just never ends, and so you don't have time for anything.
Yeah, but it's also just the bite model. We've had Stephen Hassan on Mormon Stories, one of the world's experts in cults, and we don't call Mormonism a cult on Mormon Stories Podcast because we know that's offensive and it's actually not effective, and it's insulting and rude and mean. But high demand religions oftentimes resemble cults in many ways, but we know through the bite model that what cults do is they control members' behavior through things like sexual standards, dietary standards, clothing standards. That's an essential part of what cults do to control their members. They control the information that members receive by warning them anti-Mormon literature. It's dangerous. It's scary. Stay away from anything that isn't church approved. That's the information part. They control the members' thoughts by limiting the information they have and telling them doubt your doubts. Mm-hmm. Don't have doubts. Doubt's bad. Contention's bad. And then, of course, the E in bite is emotion. Through emotion, we're kept Number one, believing by all the positive emotions that we experience in church and the hymns and the music and the choirs and the testimony meetings all make us feel positive emotion. And we're taught that positive emotion means the church is true.
Right.
And then through fear and shame, we're made to feel guilty and indebted to God and the Lord and the church. And through that negative and positive emotion, we're sort of just yoked to orthodoxy, and it takes over our lives. And it's that bubble, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So check out the Stephen Hassan interview if you haven't yet.
It's a good one.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really quickly, Madison, do you want to share any, we've been talking about all this stuff. Anything you want to add just about the bubble and about, any of this stuff prior to your dad, being released and all that stuff?
Yeah, I agree. Like, I was just incredibly sheltered, I think, and there's like a huge cognitive dissonance in my head of like things that I would hear. And yeah, there's definitely a Mormon bubble that I was in.
But you were happy, and that's part of what's hard about this is that weren't you happy?
Yeah.
It's fun being in the bubble, right?
Yeah. It's a beautiful story. I mean, and it was a beautiful life that I wanted for myself. And yeah, I was happy in the bubble.
Yeah, happy in the bubble. And that's hard, right?
Bubbles.
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. People, they'd pop the bubble if they weren't happy, but so many people are loving it.
Yeah,
And that was you, right?
definitely.
Yeah. I can't wait to hear your story. Okay, anything else you guys? This is going to end part 2, where we kind of go up to the point where you are released as bishop. So,
All I would say is that my time as bishop and my time, we've been in this ward for 24 years. And so I love the
that's
members.
a long time to be in one ward.
I have nothing but respect and love and admiration for the members of that ward. I love them.
I do too.
And I feel like they love us. I think they're disappointed in us and they're confused, but I feel like they love us. And my time as bishop, I loved the majority of it. There's things that I didn't like about it, but overall, I loved the members of the ward, and especially the youth. The youth were the best.
We really do have a great ward, and I to this day I love Farmington Second Ward. Shout out to them, some of the world's greatest people.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's a great testimony, and what a great positive, happy story. Up through 2013, right?
Take a break for 2 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to let them take a break. Go ahead and take a break. Camera back on me. And I'm going to maybe just share a couple more comments from the listeners. Juliet, we're a huge fan of Juliet Burke and her family. We hope to have the Burke family on Mormon Stories soon. They're in Oklahoma. She writes happy like a child. So she's basically saying that in the bubble you're happy, but you're happy like a child in the sense that you're naive and kind of
It's true.
You don't have all the info.
Yeah.
So it's kind of keeping you in a perpetual state of immaturity and kind of ignorance. So you're happy, but you're uninformed and you're not as developed as you could be.
True.
And so that's Julia's comment. Russell says, I'm way more happy now. I would never doubt my worth. That's good. Lisa writes, I wish I was happy in the bubble, but at the same time, I don't. It's weird. So she's basically saying, sounds like Lisa's saying, I would love to go back to the bubble, but I can't. So I'm glad I'm out, but I also a lot of people just miss the naivete and the innocence.
And you really come to love the people in your ward, and and when you're not a part of that anymore, that is a loss. Definitely is a loss.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
For sure. And we'll get to that. We'll talk all about that in the next episode. Russell writes, I defended the church and myself against the accusation of, quote, the rock in the hat in awful ways. Now we know South Park was more correct than anything the church ever taught. Of course, I'm angry. So Russell heard about the problems with the church's truth claims in South Park, and he defended the church at the expense of truth, and now he's a little bit angry about that. Yeah. Let's see. Shandy writes, yes, when I mentioned the essays in Sam Young to my believing sister, she asked me to please not talk about it to her. If she has questions, she will ask me. So basically, Shandy's talking about the very natural defense. Mormons almost have like these antibodies against evidence and information. They're like, we don't want to know. We don't want to talk about it. Don't tell me. I don't want to hear it. I'll let you know if I ever want to hear it. And of course, the most common reaction to people leaving the church is silence, because nobody wants to know why you left, because it can become like a cancer virus that spreads to their faith as well. And who wants to have their entire life turned upside down? I do, but it was painful. Lisa writes, I only started to realize how many people were leaving until about 10 months ago, when we started to research things. How huge the ex-Mormon community was so shocking to me. And
It's true.
Yeah,
Yes.
like with Leah and Cody Young, they started their faith crisis in like early 2018. And it's just like, by that time, Reddit had 100,000 ex-Mormons. Like, there were several podcasts. Mormon Stories had 900 plus episodes. Like, again, how someone reaches 2017, 2018, 2019, oblivious of the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years of progressive and post-Mormonism is mind-boggling, and it's the norm. And it's just kind of really crazy and kind of scary.
Yeah.
It is.
Welcome back, Jared. Glad you're with us. All right. Yeah, Shandy writes, I didn't hear about anything of this until 3 to 4 months after leaving the church. That's also crazy when people leave. People leave the church and then learn all this stuff, and they kind of left of their own inner conscience, but then just discovered all this stuff afterwards. And I'll just have to say, I don't think more than 1% to 5% of the current active believing membership in the church in the United States has heard of any of this stuff. To this day, with all the progress we've made, New York Times, national, international news, and all the people leaving, I still think 95% of active Mormons in any U.S. ward have never heard of Kate Kelly, never heard of Sam Young, never heard of Mormon Stories, never heard of CES Letter, never heard of Sunstone. Isn't that kind of mind-blowing?
It's mind-blowing. Yeah.
I think maybe part of that is because a lot of the members of the church, I feel, are not 100% invested in it. It's kind of a social membership for a lot of people, and it's just their life and their social circle more than it is, this super, super, super deep spiritual testimony and things.
Yeah. Emily writes, my aunt and uncle live in Farmington, New Mexico. Kevin and Tammy Eddy. Kevin served as a bishop. So we've got people with connections. Yep. So shout out to Emily for joining us. Okay. So this ends part 2 of our interview with the amazing Lusk family. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. And we're going to come right back for part 3, where we talk about the Mormon dream unraveling for the Lusks and how that happened, and what led to Madison resigning, and then most troublingly, if that's an adverb, what led to Jared being called by his stake president for disciplinary counsel. And then we're going to talk about that. So don't go away. We're going to come right back with more.